Dear readers, this story, that which would bring about the ruin of my life and happiness, is not one I share for morbid curiosity or avarice. I live in no contemplation of the past. I focus not on what simple pleasures have been ripped away from my being. Instead, I suffer my loss in the present, and hope to demonstrate the destruction wrought by an erroneous or imperfect discipline. The story of my blood is traced back to the noble stock of Germany. My father, an orphan and workman in his youth in the old country, came to be fixated on those principles of religion which are held in the highest import by the sect of the Camisards. In time, he deduced that it was his sacred imperative to travel to Philadelphia to preach those holy teachings to the heathen lands. In subsequent years, as he at once pursued his holy mission, he found a wife and was married, sired 2 children, those being my brother and I, and through the fruit of his toil to the land, produced a homestead of great value. Yet, as his zeal weakened, a fear grew within him, that in forsaking his holy duty of evangelization, he forsake his God, and within him grew a certain conviction that his demise was nearing day by day. It was within months of informing my mother of this conviction that it was miraculously made true. One night, as my father labored in the temple which he created for his daily prayer, a great light emanated and engulfed my father in flames. His screams and the fiery light of the temple drew his family from our slumber, yet only too late to prevent his fate. His death came hours later and was followed by my mother's in a matter of months. My brother and I were reduced to the condition of orphans and sent away to the care of our aunt, under whom we lived until my brother came of age. It was under these former circumstances by which dearest friend of ours, Catherine Pleyel, first came to be acquainted with us, and it was under the latter in which my brother married Catherine and produced several heirs, and those same conditions under which our story came to pass. Catherine, my brother, and I were the closest of friends, and spent many happy hours in each other's company in the old temple of my father. What had once been a place of solemnity and prayer was converted under my brother's watch into a sanctuary of levity and discussion. Likewise, the property which my father owned was transferred to my brother and myself, and our 2 houses were the setting for many felicitous meetings and celebrations hosted in alternating succession by that patriarch's 2 children. Occasionally, one more member would grace his presence to our happy threesome, Henry Pleyel, the brother of Catherine, in those instances in which his travels in Europe were suspended and his residence as our neighbor was resumed. He was in many ways a foil to my brother. Where my brother was grim, often gripped by the same invisible hand of pious contemplation that once gripped my father, Pleyel was high and airy, deriving his truth by his own rational observation. Often those 2 would debate in our happy sanctuary, as Catherine and myself would observe. Such were the circumstances under which my family experienced renewed prosperity, but likewise were the circumstances before the tragic fall which was soon to precipitate. The inciting event came after a long day of felicitude, wherein our foursome retired from the temple to my house, but my brother, having forgotten a letter in the temple, returned where we 3 did not. Upon his re-arrival at the house, he wore a look of bewilderment and bore a simple question. Had Catherine called out for him to stop as he ascended the steps to the temple? Logically, he could conclude that she had not, as due to his position on the path, would be sure to see her standing behind him. Yet this did not conquer the information that his auditory senses had provided him. We assured him that Catherine had not moved from her spot in the house, and that such a call would have been impossible. Yet due to the perilous nature of the command, my brother was unable to shake the uneasy feeling it provided him. The following instance of inexplicable providence occurred no significant amount of time later. As my brother and Pleyel engaged in a circumambulation of our land, they discussed Pleyel's desire to see our foursome return to our fatherland in Europe. Pleyel, having found a lady love in the German aristocracy, was already soon to return, yet by his calculation and the aristocratic heritage of my family, my brother could too stand to profit from such a relocation. Such was the discussion when once again the voice of Catherine spoke out and proclaimed that neither man should go to Europe, as Pleyel's lady love had fallen ill and perished. The 2 men rushed home, and once again finding Catherine and I totally bewildered to their question, resolved their ignorance to the voice's providence. Some days later, still contemplating the strange occurrences which had yet plagued my family, I was taken aback by a strange traveler who passed along the road by my doorway. His form was ungainly and disproportioned, his gait rustic and awkward, and altogether absent of that gracefulness and ease which distinguish a person with certain advantages of education from a clown. His appearance was brief, yet difficult to comprehend, and something which I still pondered as I lay in bed as the longest hour of the night drew near. Suddenly, Nearly failing to trust my own perception, I heard a faint voice emanating from a small closet at the foot of my bed, though, as I paid more attention to its being, it became more and more clearly an argument between two people who resolved to murder me. Horrified, I fled my abode for the doorstep of my brother, where I collapsed. Sometime later, hearing some strange voice calling for help, both my brother and Pleyel were distressed to find me lying at that door, the latter of which resolved to remain in my spare room for protection. Yet no further information came from this strange event. The following day, after my description of the strange man who passed my house came to be recognized by Pleyel as a man with whom he had made acquaintance in Europe, that stranger was invited to partake in supper with my family, and in time, by virtue of his sharp wit and worldly knowledge, came to be a frequent member of our frequent gatherings. Sometime later, we five had resolved to meet in the temple to rehearse the dialogue of a play which we quite appreciated. It was at this meeting I hoped Pleyel, having felt the loss of his lady love, would confess his love for me. And so, when the night fell and he had not made his appearance, thereby delaying the day's events, I was ill-enthused. I retired to my chambers for the night, and as I moved about the room, I suddenly heard an otherworldly voice call out for me to hold. Observing no speaker in my surroundings, I drew the conclusion that my closet must once again be inhabited. Yet recognizing the voice, I presumed it to be my brother, and opened the closet door. Yet, this assumption was incorrect, as I opened the door and out leapt none other than that one stranger Carwin, who declared that it was his intention to defile me, if not for the intervention of that otherworldly spirit which watched over me. With such a protector as I had for his contention, he resolved to banish himself from my society, and fled. The night passed in terror, as I remained locked in my room despite the footsteps I heard permeating the house at certain hours. When the sun rose, I opened my chamber to Pleyel's knock, who wore a look of disgust upon his face. The accusations which followed in our meeting were of the most disgusting and wanton variety, accusations of pollution and disgrace. In such anger, he hastily departed, before I could understand that the likely cause of these words were poorly drawn conclusions, stemming from his sight of Carwin departing my abode late last night. Following Pleyel's flight, I visited my brother, to whom I told the story of Carwin's threat against me. Through hints towards some grossly untoward behavior, it was clear Pleyel had communicated to my brother his allegations of my wrongdoing, and so after this interaction, I quickly flew to Pleyel's house to defend my honor. There, Pleyel once again engaged me with accusations of impropriety. When pushed on the causes for such claims, he elaborated on the occasion late last night, by which he came to overhear a discussion outside the bushes of my home, in which the voice of Carwin and myself engaged in conversation far too sacrilegious and improper for anyone of unspoiled society. Following his account, no protestation of my own was capable of pleading my innocence, and failed to halt Pleyel's hasty flight back to Europe, which promptly was resumed, leaving me all alone. On my journey home, I stopped at the home of a family friend with whom a letter had been left addressed to me several hours earlier. The document, which I read with utmost haste, was from Carwin, imploring me to meet with him at my home once again tonight. As I returned to my abode, I prepared myself for this meeting, yet upon my arrival, I found not him, but once again that mysterious voice, which called for me to hold. In haste, I hurried to my chamber and was horror-struck to see the lifeless body of Catherine lying in my bed. In the resulting shock, I could barely see my brother enter through the door behind me, and much less did I understand his grief-stricken ramblings. He pled to God that he might not make a further sacrifice, as he had already lost all that he held dear. Suddenly, from outside the house were voices and loud footsteps that ran in and apprehended my brother. It was several days before I understood what came to pass. In the intervening hours of that cursed day, my brother had heard the voice of God, who provided him with the holy commandment of the death of his entire family. Already, in my absence, that had meant the demise of Catherine and his children, and I was marked the final victim, if not for his apprehension. Such was the testimony that he provided at the courthouse, and such was the catalyst of my despair for several weeks. In those subsequent weeks, I stayed with my uncle yet, having left my journal in my home. Sometime later I returned for it. Upon my arrival in my chambers, the sobbing form of Carwin once again made his presence known. Sadly, he extolled me on how his presence had menaced my life over past months, as a voice that had followed me and deceived Pleyel, made possible through his skills of ventriloquism. Such a revelation was devastating, yet still he maintained his innocence from my brother's murders. Only, he claimed, might he be blamed in decreasing my brother's skepticism to whatever voices he might hear by his own disease. As soon as this statement was uttered, who else but my brother, having escaped from his bondage, returned to my home to finish his divine imperative? Having failed to believe Carwin's latter claims, I implored my brother to face his deceiver, yet unwilling to believe me, he angrily sent Carwin away. Mere minutes separated me from my fate, as my brother explained to me once again the divine nature of his imperative. He cursed his mission, yet moved to execute it nonetheless, when a booming voice instructed my brother to hold. The same voice continued to ring out and warned my brother of his madness. Shaken by Carwin's final trick and unsure of his mission, my brother at length took one final victim, that being himself. Such events were the story of my misfortune, which engulfed my mind for the subsequent months. I lived in my home, in the memory of these events, until one night a fire came and nearly took my life before I was rescued. In the coming days, I took refuge in traveling to Europe, where Pleyel, having been informed of Carwin's deception, found it once again acceptable to court my hand in marriage. Such are the circumstances in which I now live, yet those events which have preceded remain like specters and implore my audience to take heed, not just in the danger of the world, but likewise in what danger is created through the art of self-deception.